This video is sponsored by Camera Store.
Analog photography feels timeless yet nostalgic. It's a world filled with authenticity and endless creative possibilities, combined with a tangible, hands-on process. But as with any craft, there are a couple of mistakes that beginners often encounter. So whether you're dusting off your old analog camera or if you're venturing into the world of film photography for the very first time, this video will be an essential guide to navigate through all of the pitfalls that can happen when starting to shoot film. But if you have some experience with digital photography or even film photography already, I think there are a couple of mistakes that are important to be aware of even after years in the field. So without any further ado, let's jump right in and take a look at the 13 most common mistakes that you should avoid. By the way, I'm at a playground today because I think it's a pretty good metaphor for film photography. Ich bin auf jeden Fall schon zu groß für diese Schaukel. So one mistake I see a lot of beginners do is that they use film that is too expensive. On Instagram and on YouTube we see all these photographers who shoot something like Kodak Portra 400 or Cinestill 800T for those beautiful, beautiful tones. And while I totally get that, well, especially in the beginning, I wouldn't recommend to use these films because they are professional grade films, which means that they usually are rather expensive. Kodak Portra 400 here in Germany, where I'm based, currently costs around 20 euros a roll, and that is pretty pricey. So I would advise you to start out with consumer grade films instead, as for example Kodak Gold 200 or Fujifilm C200, because these are consumer grade films which tend to be a little bit cheaper, and especially in the beginning you will make so many mistakes anyway that I would rather advise you to spend money on more rolls instead of like one fancy roll to practice, get your mistakes in, and then once you have a little bit of experience, once you know how to work with your camera and everything, then you can move on to those beautiful pastel Portra 400 tones. But especially in the beginning, just be wise and shoot consumer grade instead of professional films. One common mistake that's pretty much a classic already, I think we've all been there, is to load your camera the wrong way. With point-and-shoot cameras it doesn't happen as quickly. Most of the time it's the case with SLR cameras like this one here, but even with point-and-shoot cameras it can happen that the film didn't catch properly and wasn't loaded properly. So with point-and-shoot cameras the loading process is usually rather easy. You put the film in, bring the tip out until a specific marking, close the camera and you're good to go. However, just watch out if your camera is showing you in a blinking indicator like a 0 or an E for empty, because this means that the film didn't load properly. But especially with SLR cameras, loading the film incorrectly can happen rather quickly because you have to put the film tip into a specific slit or into a specific take-up mechanism, and sometimes it can just not hook onto it properly. So what I would advise you to do, at least in the beginning, is to put the film in and just wind it one time to see that the sprocket holes align and the film is loaded correctly, and then close the camera. And just to double check, you can pay attention to this wheel here on the left side of your camera, because if it isn't moving, this is an indicator that your film isn't loaded properly, but if it's moving, you're usually good to go. Another classic mistake that I'm sure pretty much everybody will do at least once in their life is to open your camera and the back door without rewinding your film first. Therefore, I would advise you to make it into a habit to double check if you've rewound your film, and usually rewinding the film is rather easy. You just have to press this little button here and then rewind your film back into its canister until you hear a small click sound, and then you know that the film was retrieved from the take-up mechanism, and then you're good and safe to open the film door. But if it happened and if you opened up the film door without rewinding your film first, don't panic, it will all be good. Just try to be quick, try to close the door as quickly as possible, and don't throw out your film yet, because usually a lot of the shots on a roll can still be saved, and some of the images might also have these slight leaks, which might add an interesting level of artistry to your images. Light metering is a whole science for itself. And because of that, a lot of beginners make the mistake to only rely on their internal light meters. Well, light metering is such a big topic, it's so complex that even whole books and forums were written all about light metering, so I won't cover any specifics in this video, but because it can be so intimidating, a lot of people shy away from it and don't want to know anything about light metering, but just do what their camera tells them to do. And while internal light meters are very convenient, I use them a lot as well, they sometimes tend to not be accurate and therefore mess up our shots. So a lot of cameras use selenium cells as a light meter tool, and these are very known for not working so well anymore after a couple of years. But also with SLR cameras like this one, the camera has electronic circuits built in to meter the light, and they simply deteriorate after a little while, which means that the metering might not be as accurate anymore. But as a beginner, you might not be aware of that because you don't have a sense what an exposure should be like yet. So I would advise you to have some source of external light metering as well. There are external light meters available that usually are a little bit expensive. So instead of that, I would simply advise you to use this, your phone, because I can meter my light like this and see what the camera tells me. But since I might not be sure if this is correct, you can simply download an app, a light meter app, to double check if your exposure is correct. Because then you're just on the right path and know that you can trust this one. And this might also help you to get a better sense of exposure and metering in general. I would advise you to just take out your camera or your light meter app from time to time and just read different scenes and just get a feeling of what kind of situation needs which settings for your camera, because this is basically the language of photography. You might not need to learn the zone system, you might not need to learn the difference between reflective and incident light metering and all that, but at least it's good to have some sort of feeling about metering, to just have a bit better grip if your settings are off or not. So the next mistake that is actually in line with using a malfunctioning internal light meter is to not use a fully functional camera in the first place. In the beginning, of course, you try to not spend too much money, and therefore the first sources where you get your cameras might be relatives that maybe still have a camera lying around, or maybe flea markets where you buy the first thing that you see. However, there is nothing more frustrating than shooting a roll of film that you will never get back, and then learning later that the images were never there in the first place because the camera was broken all along. So even though it might be a bit pricier, my advice would be to get a fully checked functional camera as a beginner, because that way you can eliminate that something's wrong with the camera and that any mistakes will come from the device and not from you and your own learning curve. And therefore I would advise you to at least spend a little bit more money to have something that was tested and checked properly before use.
And one of the most asked questions ever here on this channel and in my DMs, which I almost get daily, is: where can I buy a working film camera? In my opinion, eBay still holds the risk of getting an untested camera, and local camera stores specializing in film cameras are not only rare, but also hardly accessible for people outside of the big cities. Therefore, a recommendation which solves all these issues would be Camera Store, who I'm happy to have as the sponsor of this video. Camera Store is an online store for cameras, lenses and photography accessories based in Finland. The core focus of Camera Store are restored photography film cameras, but they carry pretty much everything you can think of, including digital cameras, movie cameras, instant and also really exotic cameras most of us probably haven't seen before. At Camera Store they use authentic film era testing equipment to check the cameras thoroughly and potentially also repair items before they are being sold. Once you click on an item, you get detailed information about its condition. Restored items have been repaired and serviced and work perfectly well after that. Certified items have been found to be working correctly after testing and inspecting them with special machinery. Passed items have been tested without the need of special machinery, and not passed items are either untested or flawed and targeted towards people who want to buy these cameras for parts or for home repair. I was really surprised to see how incredibly fair the prices are, especially if you take into account that you will get a pristine camera that lets you get started with film photography straight away. While browsing the site, I have for example found this Canon AV1 for only 129 euros, which reminded me so much of one of my first film cameras, which I used to do my first baby steps in film photography with. Another bonus is that Camera Store ships worldwide to most countries, so that you can get equipment you would otherwise not be able to get locally. Further, it's really great that Camera Store sells film as well, so that you can throw a couple of rolls into the basket with your order, so that you can get started with shooting straight away. Camera Store has typically over 14,000 items in stock, so the chances of finding the right camera for you here are pretty high. The best thing though, with the code Majoka10 you can get 10% off your next order. Once again, thank you to Camera Store for sponsoring this video, and now that we have our fully functional and working camera at hand, we can see what other pitfalls to avoid.
So another mistake that I see a lot of people do is that they shoot film the same way that they would with digital. Especially if you have some experience with photography already, you apply what you know from digital photography to film photography, and while of course the base with ISO, aperture and shutter speed is the same, there are a couple of fundamental differences, especially in the way that sensors and analog material handle light. While a rule of thumb with digital is usually to rather under than overexpose, because you can still retrain some details from the shadows, while blown out highlights are blown out and you usually cannot save them with digital. With film, it's exactly the other way around. Film loves light, so there's pretty much no proper way to overexpose your film, because film has a rather forgiving latitude, at least in the highlights, not so much in the shadows. So if you underexpose your film, the information is pretty much lost. I mean, you can imagine that if there's not enough light on the film, there's no inscript of your image, there's nothing to stick on the negative, so there's no detail to retrain from it. While some people even on purpose, by default, overexpose the film by a stop or by 2 stops, just to make sure to not underexpose the film, and also because it changes the color to a little bit of a softer tone, to these pastel colors. So yeah, I guess a good rule of thumb to not fall into the pitfall is to not treat analog and digital the same way, but if you shoot film, feed the film with light, because film loves light. The next mistake on the list is to forget to change your ISO dial in your camera. I mean, you just loaded in your film, you're eager to shoot and want to get that shot, and therefore a quickly overlooked step is to change the ISO in your camera. With a point-and-shoot camera, the camera usually does this automatically because it can read the DX code on the back of the film, but with SLR cameras you usually have to dial in the ISO manually. So especially if you want to use the internal light meter or some automated modes in your camera, it's extra crucial to be sure that the camera knows what ISO film you shoot. So just make sure to change the ISO accordingly to have a fun shooting experience and not accidentally underexpose all of your film. The next mistake is to leave the lens cap on your camera. And while this is not as dangerous with SLR cameras, because you look through the viewfinder and directly through the lens, so you would notice if there is something covering the viewfinder, it is extra dangerous when shooting rangefinder cameras or point-and-shoot cameras. Even after years being experienced, it happened to me that I shot a whole black roll blank just because I forgot to uncover the lens on my rangefinder camera, because with rangefinder cameras and point-and-shoot cameras, you don't look through the lens, but you look through a window next to the lens, which means that sometimes you don't notice if there's anything in front of the lens. Since with point-and-shoot cameras, the activation mechanism of the camera usually is that you have to uncover the lens. It's not such a common mistake to have a lens cap on the lens, but nonetheless a common mistake is to have your fingers covering the lens. I guess that this is a typical parents from the 90s move to still have fingers in front of the lens, because the whole apparatus with a point-and-shoot camera is so tiny. So just a gentle reminder to keep lens caps as well as fingers outside of your frame when shooting. Another mistake that especially beginners do is to treat expired film the wrong way. In fact, some of you might not even know that film can expire. Film has animal material in there. In the emulsion there's actually gelatin, which means that film can age over time, and it also means, by the way, that film is not vegan, so sorry if I broke your world right now. But because of that, film ages, and aged film has to be treated differently than fresh film. It also has to do something with the way the film is stored, so if it's stored in a cold and dark environment, as for example in a fridge or in a freezer, it will be fresh for longer, but in general general, if we don't know how a film was stored, there is a rule of thumb that for every 10 years expired, it would be good to add one extra stop of light to the film. So if you, for example, happen to get some film from 2014 and it's usually an ISO 200 film, one advice would be to treat it like an ISO 100 film to add one extra stop of light. So there's actually two learnings here. Number one, store your film correctly, put it in the fridge or in the freezer and keep it away from light. And number two, if you get your hands on expired film, just make sure to compensate for the age and the loss in sensitivity. Another common mistake is to cheap out on developing and scanning your film. Especially since buying rolls of film is already so expensive, I see a lot of beginners just drop off their film at a drugstore. Here in Germany, for example, it's DM or Rossmann. And while there's nothing wrong with that, and while, I do it from time to time as well, they are not comparable to high-resolution scans that you get from a lab. And especially in the beginning, you might be disappointed because your colors are not looking like the colors that you see online. And therefore, my advice would be to spend a little bit more on proper development and scanning, also support the film community that way, support film labs that way, but just to be sure that there's no mistake with developing and scanning that can quickly happen at drugstores. I've had like really crazy, really wild experiences. I had a couple of good experiences too, but also like color shifts in my negatives, cut through negatives where the image was cut in half and all that. So the quality control is just way better in a proper lab. Yeah, spend a little bit more, but get some proper scans. And that way you can also print them, post them on social media and not worry about anything else related to your photos. Another misconception, and therefore also mistake, is that a lot of people don't edit their film scans. For whatever reason, people think that the scan that they get from the lab is somewhat untouchable and that you are not allowed to make any tweaks. However, in my opinion, a film scan is always just an interpretation of your negative. So you will get different results from different scanners, but also from different labs. And even if you use the same scanner and just use different settings, you will get totally different results. So in my opinion, it's a lot of kind of wasted creative potential if you don't allow yourself to edit a scan in the way that kind of fits with your creative vision, or if you want to adjust it to the way that you saw the scene. So yeah, in my opinion, it's a mistake to leave scans untouched, but just feel free to extend your kind of creative process to adjusting your scans as well. Another mistake that I was very guilty of myself in the beginning is to throw away your negatives. I know that a lot of labs, pretty much all the labs, charge extra to ship your negatives back to you, which is why a lot of beginners just rely on the film scans or even the film prints that they get. However, these will not stand the test of time. Prints, especially if it's not archival prints, will fade away over time. They are so light sensitive that in a couple of years you won't really have a sharp image anymore. And also film scans are always dependent on the current file formats and file sizes that we have around. Just imagine like a floppy disk that we used 20 years ago. Today it's pretty much unusable. So with JPEGs on your hard drive, we don't know if they will still be usable in 20 years from now. So my advice would be to keep your film negatives if you can, maybe even store them away and build up a little archive, because these you can always go back to. You can always rescan your negatives and also prove that the images you've taken are really yours. And last but not least, one of the most common mistakes that I see are people that try to not make any mistakes at all. And if you ask me, film photography and perfection are kind of an oxymoron, so there's no way to not make any mistakes. And of course, this is a video where we try to avoid common pitfalls and try to avoid mistakes. Nonetheless, I think that mistakes are part of the film photography game, and they can actually be very enriching and channel creativity and experimentation. And therefore, I think it's a big mistake to try to avoid all mistakes. In the nature of film, there are things that happen. I feel like film has a life of its own as a medium, because we have accidental double exposures, we have light leaks, we have film grain, we have artifacts that we maybe didn't account for. And I think that these things about the medium are actually what can channel experimentation and creativity. And sometimes mistakes are a discovery for new things, new projects that we maybe didn't account for before. Therefore, my biggest take-home message of them all is, of course, try to be cautious and maybe try to not make any costly mistakes, but also try to not avoid all types of mistakes, because this is what makes film film, and this is what makes film so beautiful. So in conclusion, in my opinion, film photography is like a playground. You are free to do whatever you want, you can have fun, you can experiment and you can play, and I think that this is essentially also how film photography works. Of course, it's good to take some safety precautions and maybe don't go down the big slide already, but whatever you do, there will be maybe some minor and maybe even some bigger accidents, but these are part of the game, because stepping out of your comfort zone and trying new things is the essence of film photography. So this was my list of the 13 most common mistakes to avoid when shooting film, and I myself can probably check 8 or 9 things off the list already. But of course, I would also be interested to hear your thoughts. So how many of these mistakes have you made before? And do you think that there are any mistakes that I forgot that should be added to the list? Please let me know in the comments down below. And that being said, I would say stay playful, have fun, and keep on taking photos.